Hi again, and welcome to Chapter 7, The Positive Self. I want to take just a couple of minutes to remind you all that we are at Week 7, and so we have 2 more weeks of curriculum, and then you have 1 week to really kind of firm up with those final projects and get those to me. So I know this has been a great semester, and things seem to really kick it up after Week 5. So just remember that we are on the downslide, and we only have a couple weeks left, and to really be thinking about those final projects. You can go to the tab, and you can look at all the criteria and what you want to select as your final project. There's a lot of different things. So really kind of start focusing on that. All right, so let's talk today about the positive self. We've got 7 objectives, and we've got 7 questions that will be answered in this slide presentation. So we're going to be talking about the distinguishing factors between self as agent and self as object. We're going to look at research associated with self-esteem and some of the defenses that we have when people threaten our self-esteem. We're going to be looking at the sources and outcomes of esteem and efficacy, the locus of control, and some adaptive defenses. And then finally, we're also going to incorporate some of the coping mechanisms and strategies that we use to keep our self-esteem intact and to keep it at the level that we want. All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at is, let's move to slide 1 here. We're going to be looking at self as object and self as agent. So when we look at self as object and self as agent, this is a theory that is a theory of duality. So the underpinnings of the social aspect is of self as object, and there's underpinnings as in the evolutionary world as self as agent. And so if we look at these, you can think about that evolutionary psychology deals with how we move through the world to keep ourselves self-preserved, so to speak, survival of the fittest. And so some of those things that we do a lot of times are to evaluate and look at, do things work, do things not work, according to our behaviors. And then when we look at the social aspect of it, we think about our environment and then how our environments affect us. So when we talk about the duality of self as agent and self as object, we're really looking at our actions that we have on the environment. So when we go out and we do something, what effect does that have? Was it successful? Was it not successful? And that could be communicating with other people. That can be any type of interaction. And then the self as object is how we reflect on ourselves. And if we say, you know, that was acceptable, or I think I need to tweak this a little bit, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so then we decide that the next time that we're in that particular situation that we maybe will act a little bit differently. So that's really talking about the duality of self as agent and self as object. I wanted to talk just a little bit more about it, a little more in depth, is that really people, they act on their judgments and then later reflect on how well their thoughts have served them, in managing events at hand, and change their thinking strategies accordingly. People are said to be agents when they act on the environment, but objects when they reflect and act on themselves. And so really you can see that this is just more of a process of how we give out and we act on what's going on, and then we reflect it to see how well we did in a particular situation. Okay, so we are now going to talk a little bit about, we're going to get into efficacy and esteem. And here, let me get I don't think, this is not the right question 2. So let me talk about the question 2. High esteem against negative social evaluation can be characterized. So in situations where our esteem is threatened, sometimes we have to revert back to some of those defense mechanisms. And they're not necessarily a bad thing, because we have to have time to evaluate what exactly is going on. And sometimes we have these defense mechanisms, we evaluate what's going on, and then we're able to deal with them. But with individuals perhaps with lower self-esteem, but they need to try to boost their esteem, these different defenses will come out in different ways. So what might we expect to see? And I don't know if you remember back to Psychology 101, but we can go back to some of Freud's thoughts of how we defend our own psyche. And we might see bragging. A person might brag about how good they are. They might criticize others. So the bragging is to try to build themselves up, to make themselves look big. They might criticize others to try to make the others look small. Or they might be extremely sensitive to personal valuation. So these are all things to consider when we're talking about esteem. This might be a lot of times characterized in young kids and actually adults too as maybe crying about a situation and becoming extremely emotional towards a situation. So really what we want to do is we want to be able to support an esteem by developing methods that a child or that an adult can use that are more acceptable for them to generate their own support for their own self-esteem. So let's talk a little bit about what self-esteem is. And I don't know if you remember back to that famous Saturday Night Live clip with Stuart Smalley where he says, "I'm good enough, I'm worthy, and gosh darn it, people like me." Well, you know, it was a really funny skit, but the whole idea behind that is that we have one thing within us, and that's self-talk, to be able to help us boost our own self-esteem. So self-esteem and the measurements of self-esteem, because there are many, many different types of measurements that we have, different scales that are used to evaluate self-esteem, is that it gives us an idea of where that person is at that particular point in their life. We're going to talk about this a little bit down the road, but self-esteem, depending on what's going on in a person's life, can fluctuate quite a bit. I mean, even think about transitioning from elementary school to middle school for kids. Here they're going from top dog, right down to bottom of the ladder again. And so, we have to understand that the self-esteem is going to fluctuate with what is going on in a person's life. So self-esteem is a term used in psychology to reflect a person's overall emotional evaluation of his or her own worth. It's a judgment of oneself as well as an attitude towards oneself. So remember that too, because it's not just their judgment, but it's how they treat themselves. So it's very important to really kind of start building a good type of esteem young in life so that they have a very good foundation later in life. So self-esteem encompasses the beliefs, for example, I'm competent and I am worthy, and emotions such as triumph, despair, pride, and shame. So these are all things that can be associated with esteem. The self-concept is what we think about when we talk about self-esteem, is the positive or negative evaluation of oneself. So how we reflect on ourselves is really what we look at when we look at self-esteem. It's also known as the evaluation dimension of the self that includes feelings of worthiness, pride, or even discouragement. One's self-esteem is also closely associated with self-consciousness. So how conscious we are of our ability to do things and how we promote our own self-esteem. Self-esteem is a disposition that a person has which represents their judgment of their own worthiness. In the mid-1960s, Rosenberg and social learning theorists defined self-esteem as personal worth or worthiness. Later in 1969, Brandon defined self-esteem as the experience of being competent to cope with basic challenges of life and being worthy of happiness. Now, Brandon brings in another element to self-esteem that I think is really important. According to Brandon, self-esteem is the sum of self-confidence and feeling of personal capacity and self-respect, the feeling of personal worth. It exists as a consequence of the implicit judgment that every person has of their abilities to face life challenges and to understand and solve problems, and the right to achieve happiness and be given respect. Self-esteem is similar to self-worth, or how much a person values him or herself. This can change from day to day or from year to year, but overall self-esteem tends to develop from infancy and keeps going until we are adults. Self-esteem can also be defined as feeling capable while also feeling loved. And so this was the other important ingredient that I really was interested to read about, because there's a lot of times, and I'm going to go on to talk about this, that it is important to have the self-esteem when we're incorporating perhaps a creative element, that the child also feels loved. So a child who is happy with an achievement but does not feel loved may eventually experience low self-esteem. Likewise, a child who feels loved but is hesitant about his or her own abilities can also develop low self-esteem. So healthy esteem comes when there's a good balance. So patterns of self-esteem start very early in life. The concept of success following effort, persistence starts early. Once people reach adulthood, it's harder to make the changes to how they see and define themselves. So this is why I talked about that it's very important to have that early foundation. So how do we develop self-esteem, whether it be in kids or adults? So it's wise to think about developing and promoting self-esteem during childhood. As kids try again, fail again, and then finally succeed, they develop ideas about their own capabilities. At the same time, they're creating a self-concept based on interactions with other people. This is why parental, and this can be caregiver, it can be teacher, it can be grandparent, anybody who's an influence in the child's life. So this is why parental involvement is key to helping kids form accurate, healthy self-perceptions. Parents and caregivers can promote healthy self-esteem by showing encouragement and enjoyment in many areas. Avoid focusing on one specific area. For example, success on a spelling test, which can lead kids to feeling that their only value is their test scores. So self-esteem fluctuates as kids grow. It is frequently changed and fine-tuned because it is affected by the child's experiences and new perceptions. So it helps to be aware of the signs both of healthy and unhealthy esteem. Kids with low self-esteem may not want to try new things and may speak negatively about themselves, saying such things as, I'm stupid, I can't do this, I'll never learn how to do this, what's the point, nobody cares anyway. So they may exhibit low tolerance for frustration, give up easily, or they might be waiting for somebody else to take over and do the task for them. They tend to be overly critical and easily disappointed in themselves. So kids, and you know, let's go back to even looking at a little bit of the optimism that we talked about. So this is why it's so important to kind of start pairing these things together. Because what did we say about optimism? Optimism, or kind of instilling optimism in kids, leads to an open-endedness. So having them understand that, you know, just because they have failed once, that if they try again or they try something different, who knows what the possibilities are. Because that's really what optimism leads to, is possibilities. So as you can see, a lot of these behaviors that I've talked about, they're very limiting. So we're going to learn about that right now. Imagine that. Kids with low self-esteem see temporary setbacks as permanent. Intolerable conditions and a sense of pessimism prevails. This can place kids at risk for stress and mental health problems, as well as real difficulties solving different kinds of problems or challenges they encounter. So this is why we want that open-endedness. If they fail, that's fine. We can try again, and there's possibilities down the road. So kids with healthy self-esteem tend to enjoy interacting with others. They're comfortable in social settings and enjoy group activities as well as independent pursuits. When challenges arise, they can work towards finding solutions and voice discontent without belittling themselves or others. Again, this is one thing that we talked about just this last week with creativity, and I know a lot of you talked about the fact of that part of the creative process was not necessarily that you were looking for pats on the back or looking for cheering from other people, but really that it gave you a self, an internal self, or an internal feeling of accomplishment, so which is very important. So, okay, so without belittling themselves or others. For example, rather than saying, I'm an idiot, a child with healthy self-esteem says, I don't understand this. They know their strengths and weaknesses and accept them. There's a sense of optimism prevails. So let's look a little bit at some of the defenses that we have. I want to make sure we're on this right slide. Yes, we are. Okay, self-esteem can be simply described as the worth that one assigns to themselves. The self-appraisal can affect many aspects of one's life, such as self-confidence and assertiveness, and ultimately their relationship with others. Self-esteem is essentially an essential process designed to balance one's attitudes and behaviors. Being an essential psychological process, humans have developed defenses to maintain and to enhance one's self-worth. For these defense mechanisms to become activated, two conditions are required. An event relative to the person must transpire, and the event must contain the process showing relevancy to self-esteem. So once the mind becomes aware that there's a threat to self-esteem exists, internal defense mechanisms are activated. Once this happens, people may try to distort the realities of events in effort to marginalize its impact, or they may altogether deny its relevancy at all. So that's kind of going back to some of those behaviors that I talked about, is either criticizing other people excessively or bragging about oneself. And so we can just see how these defenses really work in day-to-day activities, because you've probably experienced some of those. If not with yourself, maybe just seeing them in others. So example of these defense devices of self-esteem maintenance occur frequently and are easily observable in our society. The reaction to failure is a prime example of these processes. When someone perceives that they have failed at something, they tend to make excuses. These excuses range from unfair circumstances to directly blaming other people for their failures. This blame game is directly related to the process of defending the self-esteem from a perceived threat by creating distance. To buffer against actualization of negative esteem and of experience, the mind has constructed several methods of carrying out denial and distortion. In order for an event to have a negative effect on the self-esteem, one must have had an initial expectation of a positive outcome. To combat this, people often engage in self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is the unconscious process that involves creating a situation where the only possible outcome could be failure. In layman's terms, you can't fail if you never expect to win. So it's important to point out that even members of an entire social group may be affected by the form of self-handicapping, known as a stereotype threat. Stereotypes are assumptions or generalizations that are assigned to all members of a certain group. And this is a great topic to bring up, since we just talked about a little bit about this last week too. An example of stereotype would be to say that Caucasian men are bad at dancing. A stereotype threat are these negative assumptions about a certain group that have been internalized by a member of that specific group. Therefore, it's plausible that Caucasian men may be likely to assume that since it's been said that men of their race cannot dance, they simply cannot dance. In other words, they're not going to try. Essentially, stereotype threats breed negative thinking, and negative thinking breeds negative outcomes. And I'm glad that we had this discussion about looking for individuals to kind of be mentors, in particular groups or particular areas, because that is so important that there's good role models out there, because we can see that what happens is that when we have this handicapping even in groups, that a lot of times it can affect the self-esteem. So as mentioned earlier, self-esteem plays a significant role in many aspects of one's life, and as we've discussed, people will go to great lengths to protect their self-esteem. As I discussed, positive events have the ability to enhance self-esteem. However, people with poor sense of self-worth may have a very hard time attributing their success to their abilities. So a lot of times what they look at is that if they do succeed at something, then it must have been a mistake or it must have been a fluke. And so it generates negative thought patterns, or it's still limiting to them. This can have a very detrimental effect on their ability to live their life to the fullest. Additionally, this type of thought pattern can lead to depression, aggression, and other negative mental health issues. While humans have developed these defense mechanisms to protect self-esteem, it is important to note that it is not a foolproof system, and some may need cognitive therapy to achieve a healthy sense of self-esteem. In other words, if their self-esteem is so low that they don't feel that they can improve it, then we have to go right back to what we learned, I think it was week 2, about that cognitive restructuring and how to look at things differently, because there's some individuals that don't have that tool in their toolbox. So how can we improve self-esteem? All right, let's go on to the next slide and talk about how we can improve self-esteem. Excuse me. So we want to look at the next question here. And here we are. Beliefs regulated through cognitive, motivational, and emotional choice process are characteristics of defenses. So is that true or false? So how do we regulate those beliefs? So defense mechanisms are not something that are regulated through the cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes, are they? Because we just talked about what the defense mechanisms were. And really those are guarded actions just to defend our own psyche against any threat to our esteem. So let's see as we go on. Let's see. Okay. So how do we improve self-esteem? So be careful what you say to kids. Kids can be sensitive to parents and others' words. Remember to praise your child not only for a job well done, but for the effort. And this is what we talked about, I think it was 2 weeks ago, with Carol Dweck, and overpraising kids can be just as damaging as not praising them at all. So it's how we praise them. It's praising for the effort that they have put in. But be truthful. For example, if your child doesn't make the soccer team, avoid saying things like, well, maybe next time you'll work harder and make it. Instead, try, well, you didn't make the team, but really I'm proud of your effort that you put in. Reward the effort and completion of the task rather than the outcome. Sometimes a child's skill level is just not there. So helping a kid overcome disappointment can really help them to learn what they're good at and what they're not good at. So as adults, it's okay to say, I can't carry a tune, or I couldn't kick a ball to save my life. So use warm and humor to help your kids learn about themselves and to appreciate what makes them unique. Be a positive role model. If you are excessively harsh on yourself, pessimistic, or unrealistic about your abilities and limitations, your kids might eventually mirror you. Nurture your own self-esteem, and they will have a great role model. So let's see, other things that that can be done. Give positive, accurate feedback. Comments like, you always work yourself up into such a friendly will make a kid feel like they are not in control of their own outbursts. A better statement is, I can see that you are very angry with your brother. But it was nice that you were able to talk about it instead of yelling and hitting. This acknowledges that your child's feelings rewards the choice they made and encourages the child to make the right choice the next time, or again the next time. Create a safe and loving home environment. Kids who don't feel safe or are abused at home are at greater risk for developing poor self-esteem. And so, you know, unfortunately this happens in our world, but to counter that, there are a lot of people that have influence in a child's life and can actually be the balance that balances to the positive side of esteem. In other words, the teachers, it could be aftercare providers, a grandparent. A child who is exposed to parents who fight and argue repeatedly may feel they have no control over their environment and become helpless and depressed. So help kids become involved in constructive experiences. Activities and encourage cooperation rather than competition are especially helpful in fostering self-esteem. Yes, I know, because a lot of you are out there saying, well, I want my kids to be competitive, and yes, there are particular areas that they can be competitive, but again, remember, we have to incorporate that balance. If they are highly competitive in one thing, then maybe not so competitive in something else, where they show more cooperation in something else. So incorporating those balances so that they have a good mix across the spectrum is really a very good thing for children. Okay, let's see. I want to go on to, let's go on to understanding efficacy and locus of control. I know we're already kind of getting into time here. So let's understand a little bit of efficacy and locus of control. So how we see the world is very important to esteem, because our locus of control can either be internal, where we believe that we have a control over things, or it can be external, where we believe we are products of our environment and we have little control over ourselves. So you look down here at question 4, and it says the concept of whether events are controlled by self or chance of fate refers to what? And that's our locus of control. So how we see ourselves and how we see our destiny, whether we control it or whether the environment controls it. So understanding efficacy and locus of control. Self-efficacy was defined by Albert Bandura as one's belief in one's ability to succeed in specific situations. We can have a high sense of self-efficacy in certain areas of life and not in others. Of course, but a high sense predicts a willingness to take on relevant tasks and to work to assure that they are accomplished. When self-efficacy is high, we are more likely to be drawn to master difficult challenges, whereas when it is low, we may avoid these same challenges. Julian Rotter developed the concept of locus of control, which describes the degree to which people believe they can control their environments and their lives. People with internal locus of control believe that their own behavior determines the good and bad things that happen to them, whereas those with external locus of control believe that there are forces outside of themselves that determines what happens. There are enormous implications that these different worldviews. To be sure, good and bad things happen to all of us, regardless of what we believe about causation. But how we think about those things makes all the difference in our lives. It should be apparent that we are most likely to have a high sense of self-efficacy when we work from our perceived strengths. Moreover, although we still have experience with disappointment, frustration, and personal pain, and an internal locus of control yields optimism and determination to move forward. In other words, bad things are certainly going to happen to all of us in life, but when we have that high sense of efficacy or ability that we can control our environment, or we can control what's going to happen to us, and we have that optimistic outlook, then really this helps us to keep moving forward. And this is something that we've been talking about all along so far in the course. So everyone gets knocked down from time to time, and some people struggle to get back up. Belief that we determine the ultimate outcome in our life helps us move beyond disappointment and continue moving forward. All right, so we also have some other defenses that we're going to talk about, and some are positive defenses, and some maybe not so positive. So we're going to look at here. There's a great chart up here that talks about adaptations that we have, and these are coping mechanisms that we have. So question 6 is coping strategies are used when, oh, sorry, typo, when we perceive dependency between a stressful demand and the availabilities of a resource to meet the demand. So I will reword that question in the test bank. I'm sorry for that, but what we are looking at here really is, so do we have these coping strategies when we see a dependency between a stressful demand and the availability of resources? Sure we do, because a lot of times when we maybe have a situation where we're not sure what to do and it's stressful, then we look for an avenue to take that's either going to make it less stressful or something that we can use to kind of relieve some of that stress. So let's talk a little bit about these adaptive defenses. So adaptation, affiliation, altruism, humor, self-assertion, self-observation, sublimation, and suppression are all categories of adaptive defenses. So you can see here there's a long list of them, and it kind of talks about what each one is. I'll let you all go through that, and I'm going to talk about these adaptive defenses a little bit. So simple defenses such as denial appear during early years. Children incapable of escaping from anxiety-provoking situations block out noxious sensory experiences by example, going to sleep. During the pre-adolescent years, they are developing logical thought, and they develop sufficient skills for more complex defenses such as projection, which would be blaming other people, or rationalization, which means kind of expressing or explaining, trying to explain unacceptable impulses. So in adolescence, the advent of I'm sorry, my voice is going here. Advent of abstract reasoning skills, complex defenses such as intellectual station involved. So there is a good evidence that that abusive parent-child relationships leads to the development of major image distortion, defenses associated with borderline personality disorder. However, we have currently I apologize. My typos here are not doing me well. That adaptive defenses are the conditions which nurture their development. So in other words, a lot of times if there's conditions that are not positive within an environment, a lot of times this supports the idea of using these adaptive defenses because a child is continuously having to use them. So let me go to the next slide. I think we're going to see a little bit more of the assessments, but I'm going to talk a little bit more of being able to recognize a variety of coping mechanisms. Coping mechanism strategies are used when, oh, that's the one we just went over. My notes, I apologize. Let's just keep going on. Move on. Moving forward, I'm optimistic about this. So defense mechanisms and coping strategies are both constructive, which will explain how we protect ourselves from being overwhelmed by strong negative feelings of anxiety and frustration. However, there are important differences between the two constructs of psychological process in which they are referred. The idea of coping strategies was developed within the cognitive behavioral tradition to explain how we consciously manage situations in which external demands, such as exams, outstrip personal resources such as memory and material being examined. Defense mechanisms, on the other hand, evolve within the psychoanalytical tradition, going back to Freud, to explain how unconscious process such as repression regulate negative aspects associated with the inter-psyche factors such as trauma, memories, or unacceptable sexual or aggressive impulses. So we already talked about what the adaptive defenses were, such as anticipation, affiliation, altruism, humor, etc., etc. For all these defenses, unacceptable sexual or aggressive urges, anxiety or depression associated with conflict concerning the expression of these impulses, or emotional distress associated with managing interpersonal threat or trauma, are regulated by transforming the effect into positive action. Positive adaptive defenses enrich our lives. So they do more than allow us to make the best of a bad situation. Valiant use of metaphor or transforming base metal into gold to characterize the way adaptive defenses allow unacceptable impulses to find expression in ways that enrich our lives. Okay, so what does that mean? That was a lot of words. So basically, we have choices, and depending on our self-esteem, depending on our optimism levels and our view of ourselves, our self-perception, we can choose to have different types of adaptive defenses. And so if we go back and look a little bit here, we look at the mature adaptations, which is altruism, humor, and we talked about before that if something goes wrong, it's maybe to try to find the humor in it, or use altruism, that if we have had a bad experience, then we can use empathy or sympathy, and then to do some good for other people. Whereas we have immature adaptations where that might be acting out. You know, somebody tells you that you maybe didn't do the best job on something and that you have to redo something, and you look at them and you just say to them, well, you're just stupid. And so we probably all experience these type of reactions, either in ourselves or others. But then there's also psychotic adaptations, where it could be a person becomes paranoid, or neurotic adaptations where they intellectualize maybe their shortcomings, or they say something like, well, you know, I might not be the best soccer player, but I am the smartest kid in the school, and so, you know, people should look up to me. So it's just a different way of dealing with things, and some of them are reasonable, while others are not so reasonable, and others can actually cause distress or more distortion in a life. So when we look at, let's go to the last slide that we have here. Are we on the last slide? Oh, we're on the last slide. Okay, so let's just talk just a little bit about the practical implications, and then I am going to get going here, and so you can all have the rest of your day. So assessing and coping includes which type of scales. So here I have just for you just some example of types of scales. If you look in your book, it talks about the number of different skills. There are all sorts of inventories, ways of coping questionnaire, functional dimension of coping, coping response inventories, and adolescent coping scales. And these measures for coping have been developed for evaluating general coping styles or coping with very specific situations. So the instrument of measure of general disposition to cope in particular ways. It yields scores for task-oriented coping, emotion-oriented coping, and avoidant coping, which subdivided into distractions of social diversion. For each item, respondents indicate the frequency to which they cope with difficulty, stress, or upsetting situations in the way specified in the item. And it can be on many different types of scales. Here it can be a Likert scale, which we can see over to the right-hand side, or it might just it might be a question answer, it might be a yes/no, and so there's many different ways of assessing. So what does coping have to do with self-esteem? Well, everything, because this is just what we've learned about self-esteem, that we have either the dualism of how we see ourselves, how we value ourselves, and that plays right into how we make decisions and how we're able to cope in the world. So a lot of practical implications for the connection between esteem and the ability to see the world and to kind of navigate through the world. So that really just talks a lot about the self and esteem and efficacy. We talked a little bit about how to kind of boost the efficacy or esteem of children. I know I had put it out there, the article by Carol Dweck about praising kids, but really, you know, even if you want to get online and you want to look for some other valuable information about how you can boost esteem and keeping that balance in a child's life, or to boost your own self-esteem too. There's many different formulas out there, and it's just really all good information to kind of help support your knowledge even further on these topics. Okay, well, thanks again for listening, and I look forward to our think tank this week, and I will see you all in the tank.